Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Dan Glickman, the director of the Institute of Politics, and I want to welcome everybody here to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. Tonight, we commemorate one of the 2 or 3 most important decisions by the United States Supreme Court since the end of the Second World War. Brown versus the Board of Education changed the face of America. Brown put into motion political forces that eventually brought an end to our American apartheid, segregation. Not just in American schools, but in all of American society. I have a very special interest in going beyond Brown, because the very first public service job I ever had was when I served on the Wichita, Kansas School Board as its member and its president, 120 miles from Topeka, Kansas, the place where Brown was decided. Wichita itself went through a torturous desegregation process. Busing radically changed my community. In many respects, it tore neighborhoods apart. In much the same way it tore Boston apart and other major cities. But at the same time, the Brown decision had a profoundly positive implication to this great country of ours. So I'm glad we're here this evening talking about going beyond Brown with the leading education official in the country. Here to introduce our guest this evening is Professor Paul Peterson, Director of the Kennedy School's Program on Education Policy and Governance. Professor Peterson is the Editor-in-Chief of Education Next and serves on a Department of Education independent review panel that advises the department in evaluating the Title I program for disadvantaged students. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Peterson.
Thank you, Secretary Glickman, and good evening. Welcome to the opening event of a 3-day conference on 50 years after Brown, what has been accomplished and what remains to be done. The conference is sponsored by our program on education policy and governance, and we're indebted to the law firm Sutherland, Asbill, and Brennan, as well as to the Lynn and Harry Bradley Foundation and the John M. Olin Foundation for the support that's made the conference possible. So you're all encouraged to come to the 5th floor of Taubman over the next day and a half to hear the discussion of the many issues that have been raised in the light of the Brown decision. But tonight, we have a special keynote speaker, the U.S. Secretary of Education, Rod Page, a man for whom I have come to have the greatest admiration. Early in life, he was not only a classroom teacher and a college professor, what more can I say? But he also coached football. And as any Boston Red Sox fan or even a Patriots fan knows, anytime you are a team coach, you have a challenge. The individual team members include stars, would-be stars, laggards, misfits, whiners, and much else in between. Not only do you have to motivate and meld this motley crew into a cohesive, inspired unit, you must do all this in the glare of intense scrutiny. Accountability is sharp and clear. Wins and losses appear on the bright lights of the scoreboard and in the most widely read pages of the local newspaper. So I can think of no better preparation for the Secretary's subsequent career. As superintendent of schools in Houston, Texas, he demanded and received the respect of his staff, his school board, and his community. And rather than shrinking from the demands of school accountability and greater choice for parents, he embraced these new ideas. As a result, the Houston schools got better, markedly so. Because of his stellar performance, he was asked by the president to take on the biggest challenge of all, recommitting the American public school system to its fundamental task of providing equal educational opportunity for all, the very heart of the Brown decision. It is this Secretary of Education who has the awesome task of taking the most important piece of federal education legislation ever written, No Child Left Behind, and connect it to a highly complex, decentralized school system that operates under the control of local school boards such as that one in Houston. According to the new law, Schools must be held accountable. Greater choice must be given to those attending low-performing schools. And there are many features of this law that are the subject of a national debate at this time. And yet the Secretary needs to meld the great diversity that exists in this country together into a motivated world of learners, teachers, parents, and administrators. All of this must be done amid the bright lights of the TV cameras and in the context of the conversation in our national newspapers. There are growing signs today that Secretary Page is succeeding once again in this great endeavor. As we're going to find out in our discussions tomorrow, careful research is showing that accountability and choice are working. Students are learning more today where effective accountability is in place. Congratulations, Mr. Secretary. It's an honor to have you with us tonight.
Professor Peterson, thank you so much. And also thank you for your leadership in education. It's an honor to be here tonight. I thank Dean Glickman as well, and Director White, and all of those involved in this great school. Thank you for your gracious hospitality. I'm well aware of the appropriateness of this forum. Special forum to be held here at this great university. We refer to Harvard many times as the school of. And what we mean by that is you're the school of great leaders, African-American leaders. Think about George Ruffin, first African-American to graduate from the law school here. W.B. Du Bois, Ralph Bunche, Professor Charles Hamilton Houston, who inspired Thurgood Marshall, and many other important African-American leaders. It's easy to say the school of, but there were a lot of places during this time when there was no opportunity for African Americans. 1869, George Lewis Ruffin got his law degree from Harvard. It was unimaginable to even get in anywhere near law schools in the South and many other states. So we have a special feeling about this great university. Harvard opened its doors when most other universities kept the doors shut tight for us. This university offered educational opportunities to African Americans long before they could sit at the lunch counters or ride in the buses in Montgomery. Again and again, I've heard the gratitude of African Americans for the safe haven of scholarship here, the peacefulness of the quad, the careful mentorship of the legendary professors, William James, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Henry Louis Gates, and on and on. This university has kept the faith with African Americans, and we're deeply appreciative. So it's proper that we tonight begin a discussion on Brown versus the Board of Education. We're mindful of the courage and vision and boldness of the Warren Court's unanimous decision on that fateful day in May 17, 1954. Yes, we applaud the decision because it ended segregation, yet it did much more. It began a process of healing in America, still needed almost 100 years after the Civil War. The Brown decision affirmed the constitutional promise of equality, of justice for all Americans. It overturned laws that denied the humanity and freedom for millions of Americans. It set this country on a new course, affirming civil and human rights, while demanding the full respect and protection of the law for all people. Brown was proof positive of the genius of the American constitutional system, vindicating the trust and confidence of its judiciary that was voiced early on by John Jay and James Madison and other great leaders. Brown was a decision of courage, of conviction, and constitutionality. It was one of the finest moments of the American judicial system. And Professor Charles Ogletree has noted in his recent book on Brown, it featured the first legal dream team. Imagine in one place, working with one issue, Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, William Coleman, Scott Wood Robinson, Jack Greenberg, Robert Carter, Constant Baker Motley, and others. And then they had consultants like Whitney Young, A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins. I would venture to say that few Supreme Court cases in history could feature such high-powered brain trust as that. In my view, Brown versus the Board of Education case is one of the most important decisions in our history. Of course, I'm not a lawyer, historian, but the best law is understandable and evident to everyone, not just those with legal training. And so, as someone who's lived through segregation, I know that Brown made our country more equitable, more just, and more decent. In the 1950s, this country suffered. And when I say suffered, I really mean suffered because of its racist history. Racism is more than geography. It's more than unfair laws. It's more than just something in history to study about. Racism is something I felt personally. I grew up in Mississippi, in a small rural town there. It's a mental and social disease. It's a manifestation of hatred. It's a threat to our collective sanity. It's a damning critique of our culture, subversive to our Constitution, springing from slavery. It's unavoidably rooted in our national history. Like many of you, I know firsthand the powerful grasp of segregation in the minds of millions of Americans, people who otherwise were often pious and law-abiding and sometimes well-educated, good, well-intended people. Some of these people were my neighbors in Mississippi. For them, segregation was a natural way of life. It was part of the natural order. It was a mindset about race and ethnicity. They believed, as generations of Americans before them believed, that segregation was an acceptable way of life. And it was in the best interest of everybody, they thought. It was something they couldn't imagine even questioning. I wonder if people who haven't lived through segregation can even imagine its devastation. It offers no hope, no opportunity for change, no trust, no humanity. It reaches into every home and every place of business, and everywhere you go, it's pervasive. The schools bred racism, they actually encouraged it. Children were taught that separate facilities were educationally necessary, and that equal treatment was somehow manifestly good. Whites were told to fear blacks, and that they were not fully human. There was institutional reinforcement in restaurants and transportation and every aspect of your life, in higher education, in K-12 education. Everywhere you looked, you saw this different. I graduated from high school and attended Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. It was one of 3 institutions in Mississippi where I could have attended. The other 2 were historically black institutions as well, because I couldn't go to Ole Miss or Mississippi Southern or Mississippi State at that time. And like many African Americans, I had to go north for my graduate work. In my case, I attended Indiana University. I'm often astonished at those who think segregation is just somewhat of an inconvenience or some other way of seeing the world. It's legalized oppression, actual state-supported violence. And there was actual violence, false imprisonment, being locked up for little of anything, constant fear of anything that looked like a policeman or a person who represented the law. You knew firsthand that anything you did was wrong. Disappearances and vigilante lynchings. It was legalized violence against a minority that had been brought to this country against its will, suffered oppression for hundreds of years, and finally set free and still, after that, found itself without adequate legal or community protection in many parts of our nation. Later, immigrants came to this country with the promise of the American dream. But yet, many members of our community were there already, but could not aspire to parts of the American dream. Well, segregation was a continued, persistent failure to perceive the obvious, that we're all human beings. There was no moral justification for this. The real reasons were grotesque. The real reasons involved ignorance and fear and hatred and selfishness. The law was no help either. It actually codified the hatred. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court found that segregation could be justified, and listen at the justification, and I'll use the actual words, because of the, and I quote, established uses, customs, and traditions of the people, with a view to the promotion of their comfort and the preservation of the public peace and good order. In short, precedent in custom and law was more important than our constitutional promises of human acts and decency. But 50 years ago, the Supreme Court overturned the odious decision, sending seismic shockwaves through our country. In his oral argument before the Brown versus the Board of Education trial, Thurgood Marshall said, any way you look at this problem, you can't describe it another way except race. His actual words were, you can't take race out of this. He was right. It wasn't about custom. It wasn't about state rights. It wasn't about legislative intent or any of the other things that cloaked the debate. Segregation was about genetics and skin color and race. And the members of the court saw that. If you look at each mention of the racial question in the decision, you'll see the court squarely focused on denying the relevance of race as a barrier to education. But they did see the barriers of harmful and pernicious activities. And they said, with explicit documentation provided by Kenneth Clark and a host of sociologists and psychologists, in the famous long, well-substantiated and much discussed footnote 11. In ending segregation, the doctrine of separate but equal was exposed as being unconstitutional. It did not square with the ideals of this great country. What a day for celebration. I still remember that now. There are at least 3 dates that are embedded in my memory. I remember exactly where I was the moment that we heard about the assassination of Martin Luther King. I remember exactly where I was when I got the news about the assassination of President Kennedy. And I know exactly where I was when we heard the news about the Supreme Court Brown versus the Board of Education ruling. Of course, segregation didn't disappear right away. The pace of change was slow, and it remains slow, measured in decades and sometimes in generations. Many studies show that Brown didn't trickle down to some states for more than 20 years, and sometimes even later. In other words, well into the 70s, there were still states that practiced a form of legalized reasoned segregation in defiance of the Brown decision. And the unwillingness, of course, to enforce the decision was only one manifestation of the unwillingness to change. Court cases were filed and refiled again to delay the implementation of the decision. There was widespread violence. The sheer magnitude of the force of the resistance has no domestic equivalent today. But in the Carolinas, in Georgia, in Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana, Tennessee, Texas, and elsewhere, it was a second civil war in many cases. In Virginia, one school system, Prince Edwards County, shut down for 5 years rather than accept the Brown decision. In some states, governors and other elected officials, and even police, actually led the resistance. Dr. Martin Luther King was right when he spoke of their lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. They were proud to resist Brown. They looked for any means possible to resist. In many cases, we were exiles in our own land. But our country survived the massive resistance because of the strength and the conditions and the strength of the Constitution and the steadfast courage of some powerful Americans, including many individuals who risked everything to change things for our people. People like Rosa Parks and Medgar Evers, the Freedom Riders, the marches, the Montgomery to Alabama March, Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King, and others and others and others. The martyrdom of Medgar Evers and King underlie the many sacrifices that people of conscience made to fully share in the American promise. Because of the Brown decision, we're stronger, though. And this nation is more equitable and it's more just as a nation. But we still have a long way to go. Education is still the best place to continue pushing for this change that will make our society a better society, that will make this nation a really great nation that it promises to be. Education is the battlefront. Educational problems must be solved, or we face continuations of this kind of devastation. Equality of opportunity is more than just a statement of the law, it's a matter of fact, the need for it. And factually speaking, millions of children in this country don't quite get that yet. There's been much recent discussion of internal segregation in our schools, a process of resegregation between schools, including studies right here from your own Harvard Civil Rights Project. There are scholars like Stephen and Abigail Thurnston who've documented the frightening and steadfast black-white education gap, which I believe to be our most pressing social difficulty. It is the civil rights issue of our time, the achievement gap, the gap between the academic performance of the ethnic communities. Brown only opened the door to a great education. But 50 years after Brown, we still have a lot of work to do here. The No Child Left Behind Act has some important parallels to the Brown case. President Bush and a bipartisan majority in Congress recognized this problem of the achievement gap. Some fortunate students receive a world-class education in the United States of America. There are islands of excellence all around our nation, but that's not the whole story. There are many who don't share these islands of excellence. Some of these schools have fine teachers and fine principals and fine PT and PTO supporters, but we need more of them all over because there are many students who are not enrolled in those schools. Students in poorly performing schools may have had good teachers or excellent administrators or even plentiful resources, or they may not have had. Many students do not read at their grade level. Some are many years behind. Some can't read at all. There are similar problems in mathematics. For example, by the time they reach 12th grade, only 1 in 6 Black American students and 1 in 5 Hispanic students can read at grade level. Now repeat that. By the time they reach the 12th grade, only 1 in 6 African American students, K-12, and only 1 in 5 Hispanic students can read at grade level. Math scores are even worse. Only 3% of Blacks and 4% of Hispanics are testing at proficient levels in mathematics. And there's another bit of data I'd like to share with you. Just recently, a couple years ago, we celebrated the SAT scores improvement for American students. But disaggregate the data and see if this improvement was across the board. You find that there was no improvement in the African American student community, and you find that the Hispanic students even lost ground. And every indication from every measure told us that we are confronting a deeply divided, desperate education system. One that is producing results is very much like an apartheid system. There's no exaggerating these facts. Millions of children are being left behind, millions. And we know who these students are. They're poor students. They're minority students, low-income students, special needs students, limited English proficient students, students that bring challenges to the teaching workforce. And this is the 21st century, not the 50s, when we were arguing Brown versus the Board of Education. In my view, such division, it was wrong in 1954 and it's wrong today. Education is about knowledge and about finding oneself. It is devastating for a child to be provided no intellectual tools and to be set adrift with no means of finding its way back. I believe that when a child is left behind by an education system, it's not only a problem for that child, it's a problem for us as a nation. I give President Bush and the Congress much credit for seeing this problem and willingness to take it on as an issue. President said if elected, he would institute change, and he did. Within 4 days of assuming office, he initiated the blueprint which became the No Child Left Behind Act. He presented this to Congress as a blueprint and said, I wish for the Congress to take a vigorous bipartisan discussion. And then what resulted was a No Child Left Behind Act, passed with wide bipartisan support. The president immediately signed it, and it became the law of the land. And with this law and with this tool, we began to address the achievement gap. It's radical surgery, it's massive reform, it's old ways no longer tolerated. We demand equity, we demand justice, we demand inclusion, we demand accountability. No Child Left Behind is a powerful sweeping law. It is the logical next step to Brown. Brown opened the door. Now No Child Left Behind, we can provide something of substance inside the building. The ancient Greeks say education is freedom. Does that mean we can't have freedom without this? If that is the case, I call your attention back to the data we just talked about. And you can see the threats to our freedom. No Child Left Behind is about freedom. We can make the argument now that it is not only about education, it's about freedom. It's about the way we learn, and about our life, and about our society, and about the kind of world we want to live in, about a great nation like our nation. Because of the powerful sweep of this change, this revolution has met some resistance. And that's to be expected. The resistance to Brown was massive, and it's sustained over generations. We can't afford to have that long argument about this. Those who fought against Brown were on the wrong side of history. And those who are fighting against the No Child Left Behind Act will be judged so as well. We've come to expect stride and resistance in any major change in education, particularly because it disturbs the status quo and challenges some well-entrenched establishment. The opposition has been fierce, multifaceted. Some people will simply stop at nothing to undermine the law, looking for any excuse, any flaw, any link. This won't stop us. It is much too important. Understand this new wave of massive resistance. They hope to chip away at our resolve, to cause our commitment to crumble. They hope to destroy our will, to make further progress difficult as possible. They can't win. It's too important. Some argue they are so-called unfunded mandates, even when the president has committed historical levels to educational funding to elementary and secondary schools. Several studies, including one published right here in Education Next, Mr. Castrell, thank you for your great work, shows that the law is adequately funded. There's nothing unfunded about a proposed $57 million discretionary federal budget for education in 2005. That's a 36% increase over the amount of dollars available when the president took office. It also provides another $57 billion in mandatory federal funding for student loans. We already see the considerable evidence that the law is beginning to make positive changes. The most recent NAEP data, the mathematics scores in 4th and 8th grade began to show some improvement. And important, this improvement is taking place among African Americans, Hispanics, and low-income students, and students who you would not normally see that growth. As a result, the achievement gap is in some places narrowing in both 4th and 8th grade. Further evidence comes from a recent report by the Council of Great City Schools. Students in the largest urban school systems showed improvement in reading and math in the first year under the No Child Left Behind Act. And I specifically congratulate the big city superintendents and school boards and people who operate the big cities, because we must improve there. The studies reviewed test scores from 61 urban school districts in 37 different states. We need, of course, to build on this progress. There are profound and lasting consequences if we don't. If we fail to fully implement this law, millions of children will be harmed by being excluded. Who among us would wish that for any child? We have to seize a future that ends racism and division in our schools. We must have a vision that that pictures our schools as successful, inclusive, fair, and equitable. We must work for harmony and common ground and bipartisan support for meaningful, lasting reform. 210 years have passed since Brown. It may take generations to finally achieve equity of opportunity, but a race-free society must start with fair, inclusive education. Education is the battlefront. That is where we must build the foundation of fairness and the foundation of hope and the foundation of decency. We must make our schools equitable in order to make our society equitable. Our work for the future begins in our schools, and it begins in our educational institutions. In his speech in Washington at the Mall, Dr. Martin Luther King spoke about the future. He said African Americans and those fighting for equity must never be satisfied and must never be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. We must never give up. I believe that we must never give up or give in. The struggle for equity and the struggle is too important. It is too important not only for us, but for our Constitution. We have much work to do. There's still many difficult trials ahead. There's still strident opposition. But no child left behind, as the logical next step to Brown versus the Board of Education must succeed. I believe the President and the Congress have taken this country one step closer to a race-free society. And with each step we make, we get closer to fulfilling the promise of Brown versus the Board of Education. This is a great country. It will be even greater when we bring these dreams to fruition. Thank you so much.
The Secretary has agreed to take questions, so we would like you to keep your questions pointed. All questions end with a question mark. And so long statements that end with periods are not questions. But so there's lots of people who may have questions, so make your point shortly, and the Secretary will respond. So anybody have the first question?
I can start.
I see we have people are lined up here at the mics. You, right here.
Oh, okay. Mr. Page, recently you dubbed the National Education Association a terrorist institution. I'm wondering, even in jest, why you would make such a claim, considering that it adds to the sort of that sort of dirties the politics around the issue, and if you feel that there should be consequences for that.
You know, I've had opportunity to speak on that many times. I don't think I got anything to add to it. I think my comments stand as they were made.
All right. Next question from over here.
Dr. Page, as a past New York City public school teacher who felt the need to teach to the test in my classroom, how are you dealing with states that feel the need to lower their scores and lower their standards in order to deal with No Child Left Behind?
Well, the tests that we hope that we can get at each state would be tests that are developed by the state to align specifically with the standards that the state itself set. We'll have 50 different standards set for 50 different states. We have 50 different almost sovereign entities, 52 actually with the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. They'll all set standards, both content standards and performance standards. Then they will build an assessment system test to align to those standards. Now, hopefully there will be good, strong criterion reference tests. And teaching to that kind of standard is a different thing than teaching for a test like the SAT, which the original SAT was an aptitude test. But the content and the assessment should be so aligned and so tight that there shouldn't be a lot of difference between them. And so that type of test that we're pulling for doesn't give the kind of devastation that one would expect when we talk about teaching to the test as a negative thing. Because in many cases, this is reteaching the content the standards that are built, the test is built from. So we hope we can get that kind of alignment with the test. And inside, we don't make a big distinction between the test and the standards. They essentially should be pretty much the same thing.
Okay, back to this side.
Yes, in the United States, the funding for schools is often highly based on local property taxes, which leads to a situation where poorer schools will have a lot less funding often than wealthier schools with a wealthier student population. Do you feel that this is a major problem? And if so, what are you doing to redress this and to make sure that the neediest students are getting the funding that they need and the quality of education that they need to succeed?
Of course, we're concerned about that. We want all students, every American, to have an equal opportunity. But let's begin with some context. In our nation, the founding fathers didn't include a statement about K-12 education in the Constitution. But they did provide some specific language that indicated that is not specifically spoken there is a prerogative of the state. And so I try to put this in a mild way, but the state of Texas is responsible for educating the students in Texas, as the state of California is responsible for educating the students in California. And each one of them would have the responsibility to develop a funding system that would provide the kind of equity that you and I both hope that they can achieve. The federal funding system is a completely different funding system from that, and it's not designed to supplant the state's responsibility, but it's designed to supplement the state's funding. And it averages about a little better than 8% of the average per pupil expenditure come from the federal government. And most of that is targeted for specific purposes. In the No Child Left Behind Act, it is targeted to students most in need, those that meet the poverty threshold. But it is good for the whole system. So whereas we hope that states will address the issue so that every child in America would get equal opportunity for an education, it is a state issue about funding. We will make sure, though, from the federal level, that the federal funding is equitable and targeted specifically at those most in need.
One more quick comment, but considering...
There are so many questions that we have to keep moving. Yes, right up here.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Pablo Torres. I'm from MIT, a grad student. Representative English introduced a bill to the House last October that could give some tax benefits to grad and undergrad students. If this bill is passed, it would represent around $1,000 more per year per student. We have been doing some lobbying work with the National Association of Graduate and Professional Students, and we think that these kind of initiatives would really promote higher education in America. I wonder if the Bush administration is doing something to get some more co-sponsor for this bill.
In the President's 05 budget, there are several lines that have tax incentives for graduate students linked to certain contributions in education, especially graduate students and students who want to teach in the high demand fields like math and science and special education and fields like that. We believe that tax incentives would be a great way to provide some motivation at the same time or provide assistance for student aid.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Carmen Lopez. I'm an employee at the U.S. Department of Education and a student at the Kennedy School of Government. The U.S. Department of Education has placed most of the high school change programs in the Office of Vocational and Adult Education. And these programs haven't been supported in the last several presidents' budgets, and these programs have largely been untouched by the new expectations and the support of No Child Left Behind. And I'm concerned about the signal that it sends that high school change programs are in the vocational education office and are getting so little support, and I'm wondering if we can expect to see an increase in the support from the administration and from the department towards increasing achievement at the high school level.
Located in OVE, Department of Vocational Education, is the traditional location for the high school programs. That's what we found when we got there. We've not changed it a lot, except that we are changing the emphasis on that. You're going to find, your last part of the question is, can you look forward to stronger emphasis in high school? And the answer is yes, because we are understanding now that there's a lot of work to be done in high schools. You're going to see some very innovative ideas about how to improve the operation of our high schools. I think one of the biggest ones will be the State Scholars Program, where states are asking students to take more rigorous courses and more courses in exchange for certain incentives. It's already existing now in 12 states, and I think there are about 9 states preparing to go on board now because it requires some cooperation from the states. And that is going to, I think, make a substantial difference in the performance of high schools. There are other initiatives that are there as well, too. The President's Struggling Readers Program. We're now looking at students who've achieved high school status but still are having difficulty in reading. We're providing support there to help those students. So the short answer to your question is yes, very much interested in the performance of high schools. We recognize very clearly that our high schools are not performing as we would wish them to.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing yourself, which is a good practice if the rest of you would do that as well. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Eddie Martinez. I'm a master's student at the Harvard Grad School of Ed. I wanted to know if you could respond to research that has shown that in schools that are the schools that are under this NCLB mandate focus their resources and time on students on the cusp of the proficiency test scores, taking resources away from students that are, one, past the proficiency mark already, and students that are also way below and sort of in what can be considered helpless.
Well, first, I'm not familiar with that research, but if you could provide me with it, I'd be very interested in that because that's the outcome that we would not hope to see. We want it to be much broader than that. Now, we don't want this to be at the expense of students. We want this to be to help students. So provide me with that research, then I'll make some comment.
Is it, who is that? McNeil and Valenzuela did a study that proved this in Houston.
Okay. Back over here, sir. Introduce
Hi.
yourself. Yeah.
My name is David Meadow, and I'm with the Appian, which is the student newspaper at the Graduate School of Education. You talked about a lot of institutional resistance to NCLB, and from what you said, it sounded like the usual suspects who are afraid of change. Now, my perception from the people I've talked to, it seems to be that the liberals and progressives are the ones that fear NCLB because of the reasons that the lady cited, the teaching the test and did you perceive it as being the liberals and progressives who were against this? And if so, what motive would they have for wanting to keep education separate and unequal?
No, I think that's a significant challenge across the spectrum. I would not categorize it into that particular straitjacketed community. There are some arch conservatives that are showing some opposition too. But I don't want to leave the impression that that's so massive that it's destructive. I think that the resistance is the way we do things as far as change is concerned, but we're making great progress in all the states. The predominant activity is very positive in all of the states. And what we are finding is that some of the discussion about issues where they have some opposition is broad. It goes across the spectrum. It wouldn't be straitjacketed into one category as you suggested.
Back up here, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Wayne. I'm a scientist in a pharmaceutical company. Thank you for sharing tonight. When you share about segregation, it hits me greatly. I don't know if you are aware of, a segregation happening in China right now, and it's not based on people's race, but it's based on people's belief. People of Falun Gong practitioners persecuted, and especially in the educational system, students expelled because they didn't want to give up practice, and teacher has been put into labor camp because they don't want to give up. I just want to ask, would you help using your excellency and also your influence to help those people to keep their basic human rights to being educated as students, and also teachers who can, continue to teach students? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your point. I'm not sure how to answer that, except that we are interested in humanity wherever it exists, all across the world. I'm sure that our State Department and other people who are involved in foreign issues would be concerned about issues like that, and maybe that's something I can call to their attention.
Thank you.
All right, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, Secretary Page. My name is Ted Bosk, as a second-year student at Harvard Law School. As a displaced Texan and former employee of the Texas Business and Education Coalition, I wanted to...
Great organization.
I wanted to thank you for your support as superintendent for the Texas Scholars Program, and now your support as secretary for the State Scholars Program.
Excuse, let me interrupt you. I hope you noticed what he did was just say this National Scholars Program was patterned after Texas Scholars Program. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but we certainly appreciate your support in spirit, especially. My question tonight is, given the rapid growth in the Latino student population, what efforts are the Department of Education making to extend the Brown dream of access and integration to this culturally and at times linguistically isolated student population?
Well, it has a strong emphasis on English language learners, those students who come and who have limited proficiency in English. We think one of the best things that we can do is help provide that proficiency. And so that part of the No Child Left Behind Act is a special part that is very highly funded, and we have a lot of professionals who are spending a lot of time about that very important part of our community. And it's a very important part of the school population, too, that we want to assist. And we think many of the problems that are being experienced there are tied to limited English proficiency. So the No Child Left Behind Act speaks directly to that.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Secretary Page. I'm Paloma Zepeda. I'm a sophomore at the college. You referred to Professor Orfield's numbers that find increasing segregation. Do you think that this segregation is something that is a pressing educational issue, and how should it be addressed? Do you favor neighborhood schools, or do you favor increased busing?
See, you notice how she boxed me in on those two? That was good. I'm aware, that's discussion that's going on here in this community now. And we think the good people of this community will make a decision on how it should best operate. As far as the segregation that we see now and how that differs from what we talked about with the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, is that segregation was supported by the law. It was legalized, enforced segregation. It had a message that part of the American population was inferior and unworthy of the protections of the Constitution. It was mean and demeaning. That is what Brown did away with. Segregation based on housing patterns, based on economic conditions, is also something that we should be concerned about. But it's a different kind of segregation. And as far as schools are concerned, I think we must improve schools wherever they are, whether in communities or for people who have access to them from the community or other places. And now do I think that a child who is in a community school like that is automatically mandated to have an inferior education. I think they will have an incomplete education in an environment where there is one ethnic group, but they can have a fine education. I think a complete education would require some type of exposure to the other parts of the community that you can live with as a citizen of the United States of America.
Over here.
Hello, Secretary. My name is Eric Lesser. I'm a freshman at the college. And I was just wondering, in your intro remarks, you talked a lot about the achievement gap. And I was just wondering, in your opinion and from your experience, do you think that this is a problem more related to class and to economics or to race? And how should we go about, or what policy should we do to change that, depending on which?
Abigail and Stephen Thornton have spoken to that in their book quite a bit. There are a lot of other works out there, excellent works too, that address the achievement gap. There's still some discussion by sociologists and psychologists and even educators about the causes of the achievement gap. It's a very complex phenomenon. And so rather than saying now that I know the answer to that, I approach this with solid, good, hard, high expectations, quality pedagogy. I think that can make a change. I saw that make changes as I was serving as superintendent of schools in Houston. I saw students who come from the most deprived circumstances. When the pedagogy is right and the expectations are high for students and a low tolerance for failure, I saw students improve under conditions like that. So we hope that the underpinning tools of the No Child Left Behind Act, accountability, not making excuses about students' economic circumstances, not making excuses or having low expectations for students because of the accent of their speech, or even when they came across the border. But saying that every child that shows up on the front porch of a school is a worthy American and a worthy child, and that child will get a good, solid education. We expect that child to achieve at high levels just like we do every other child. So I know that's not the complete answer to why we have the achievement gap. It is simply the approach that I use in approaching it. And I continue to look at the research by the fine scholars who help us with this to learn more about this. We must learn more about it because I think the achievement gap is our most pressing social issue of this generation. I think it is the civil rights issue of our time. I think our other goals of full humanity and complete equity as citizens of the United States would be greatly retarded during the existence of the achievement gap.
Hello, Secretary Page. My name is Stephen Fairfield from Fifth Ward in Houston, and now a Loeb Fellow here at the Design School. Thank you for what you helped us do in Fifth Ward. I'm very excited when I go back to Houston this coming year to help develop Gateway Village affordable housing communities in the suburbs where many jobs now are being created so that low-income families can both live near their work and attend the schools of opportunity there. But in girding for the battle, I found that there's very little data to help address the fears of suburban residents about affordable housing. And I was wondering, is it possible that the department, perhaps working with HUD, could help sponsor some studies and help gather data so that models can be developed so that these fears could be overcome?
We'd be very interested in working with HUD to achieve more understanding of that phenomena. I don't know of any particular activity underway at this present time that's aimed at providing answers there, but you've given me a good idea, and so I'm going to talk to Secretary Jackson when I get back to see if there are some ways we can cooperate on the project like that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Secretary Page. My name is Kevin. I'm a first year at the college. Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. has proposed a constitutional amendment guaranteeing a high-quality education, and I was wondering what your views are on that.
Well, I too would be in favor of a high-quality education. I think a high-quality education, I think that there's multiple factors involved. My sister was the dean of the College of Education in Norfolk State, and we used to argue about pedagogical issues a lot. One of the things that I said was that there are three elements here, and that is the quality of the pedagogy, the quantity of it, and the engagement of the student. And of the three, what we've done less well, I think, is in the engagement of the student. Teaching and learning is an interactive process that requires activity on the part of the student. I think all of this must come together. Every student should have a constitutional right, because I believe education is a civil right, just like the right to vote and the right to be treated fairly under the law. But I also think there are so many other factors that are involved. And there are some emerging research out there that shows us that we've got to do much more now to engage students to get more activity from students.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Fred Smith. I'm a senior at the college where I study sociology and Afro-American studies. I want to thank you for coming tonight. My question concerns high-stakes testing. I know that Nicholby does not require high-stakes testing, and by high-stakes testing I mean tying negative sanctions at the individual student level based on test scores, for example, not allowing a student to graduate or move on to the next grade level. But some individuals, such as the mayor in New York City, has suggested that we should use the tests that are mandated by Nicholby. We should also use those as high-stakes tests. And I was wondering what your opinion was on that.
I'm not sure that I have a formed view, if I understand your question in particular. Let me approach it this way. I think the highest stake of all is the stake of a child not getting a high-quality education. I think we as a nation have a lot at stake, and the child also has has something at stake. I think first we should enable success. In other words, provide the tools that would be needed in order for a child to get a high quality education. And then we should measure to see if that education has been attained. If that education is not attained, I'm not sure that we're doing the child a great service by providing them further mobility, if that's what you're speaking of. I think it's much more efficient to make sure that as they go forward, that they've mastered the tools they need in the present grade before they move on to the other one grade. Now, there should be multiple opportunities. You know, if we're talking about just having a test one time and making big decisions about that, we should enable success first. But I don't at all object to making decisions based on how a student performs on a valid, reliable, objective assessment tool, a test.
All right, so it's 9 o'clock. I think we can go a little bit longer. This question over here. Yes, sir.
Hello, Secretary Page. My name is William Dunn. I'm a student at Tufts University. My question has to do with, in 2001, the NAAP ranked the state of Texas #1 in the improvements they made from 1996 to 2001. However, during that same time, the NAAP saw a 6-point increase in the achievement gap between non-Asian minorities and whites. How does the NCLB better focus funding and support towards closing the achievement gap, better than Texas and other states like North Carolina?
Well, I think a lot of the elements are similar, and one of the big drivers would be disaggregating the data. And we think once that data is made visible, then it informs instruction. So if we see part of the subgroup, and you reference the Asian community and the Anglo community, where there is in some cases a gap also, this gap then becomes visible to community people who cause changes on the part of the operation of the system. And we have a system in education that's powerfully driven by local people through school boards and that type of influence. And one of the things we can look forward to that's going to really power change that is brought about by the No Child Left Behind Act is the availability of information based on the data that they get from how schools perform and how the individual children perform and how school districts perform. I think the nation is going to be awfully interested in that information. And once they get that information, I think that information is going to power a lot of change. Dissatisfaction is a powerful motivator for action. And when people begin to see these scores, they're going to ask questions on why it's like that. And they're going to begin to make choices and ask for different action. So I think it's going to make a change in every place, not only in the gap between the Asian community and the Anglo community, but we also have another gap, in the gap between the United States of America and our Asian and European neighbors that we've got to be working on, especially in science and math.
Well, I think what we should do now is just go around the room a little and pick up a few questions at a time and let the Secretary respond to those that he thinks he can best respond to. So why don't we start with you, sir?
All right. Secretary Page, I'm David Clevin. I'm at the Graduate School of Education here at Harvard. Earlier you mentioned that the states all have their own standards and corresponding tests. And in Texas, test scores have gone up a great deal. But according to research from the Education Trust, comparatively on national tests, Texas is not faring as well as many other states, and this reflects a difference in the standards and the tests, I assume. My question is, what is being done, because I too am in favor of increased accountability, what's being done to keep the market forces from driving standards down rather than lifting people up? Because if schools, districts are being punished, or if individual schools are being punished for not doing well on tests, then it seems to me, since there are different standards, it might drive it down.
Okay. So keep that one in mind. It's a good question. Okay, move on. Yeah.
Good evening, Secretary Page. My name is Maya Harris. I'm also a student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, master's student. I just have a question about the resistance of several states to NCLB, and specifically given the resistance of several states to NCLB, specifically around the sanctions related to not meeting adequate yearly progress. In retrospect, what would you do differently in order to implement NCLB And specifically, how might you engage states so that you would garner more support from them?
I know this is a test, Secretary Page. It's a high stakes test too. I want you to know. Okay.
Hello, my name is Ashley Nathanson. I'm a freshman at the college, and I was just originally from Maryland, and about 2 years ago, Maryland passed the a law revamping the educational system in Maryland in cooperation with the No Child Left Behind Act to kind of redo the funding for Maryland public schools. And in that case, Maryland got rid of a lot of specialized grant funding and replacing it with giving bulk grants to school systems so they can decide where they thought the money could use best. Is the federal government at all considering replacing specialized grants for schools so school systems can better use their funding in what they need, or if not, can you defend the specialized grant funding that is now going on in public schools?
Mr. Secretary, I think it's time to let you respond to some of these questions.
With respect to the special ed funding, special ed grants to states. And we think that's fully appropriate because states then would be better to target funded best rather than funding being targeted from the federal level. Our whole idea is that people at the local scene know much better than we do. With respect to the state resistance, and we hear a lot about that. Democracy is not a tidy process. There's a lot of discussion and debate, and that's good. We benefit from it. We even benefit from the criticisms because we listen carefully. In fact, much of the flexibility that we've been able to provide since October of last year has been because we were paying attention to the challenges that school districts had when their state plans, which were first approved in June '03, met the reality of schooling for the very first time in September and August of '03. In October, we began to look at those challenges, and we found out that they pile up in 3 piles: limited English proficient students, IDEA students, highly qualified teacher, and 95% participation rate. In each one of those cases, we were able to provide some flexibility inside the law without going back and asking for some legislative remedies for the law. With respect to the Education Trust, our reading of the reports from the Education Trust has been very positive, and they're very strong supporters. And I'm not familiar with any report where it was hostile towards activities that went on in that particular state that you named. In fact, I can show you several reports where it was very complimentary of what was going on there. See, what else did I miss? State resistance. As I mentioned, the state legislative sessions were taking place in all of our states. And during that period of time, you get a lot of discussion and a lot of debate, and a lot of people who have different ideas. And I think that's good. That's the way we operate in this country, and that's important. But it's also important to note that the predominant activity relative to the No Child Left Behind from states is compliance, hard work, movement towards making sure that their systems work. In fact, the Improving American School Act of 1994 required states to set high standards, measure against those standards, and have those standards approved. When we arrived in 2001, less than 15 of those states had. Today, all 50 states, including the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. So I know you hear a lot of discussion, and I've indicated that that's good, but every state is working hard to implement the No Child Left Behind Act. We have not had a single state yet that's taken destructive actions about not being a part of the No Child Left Behind Act.
Well, I wish this could keep going. It's such a great conversation. One last question from up here.
Wow, I feel privileged. Thank you, Secretary Page, for coming to speak to us tonight. My name is Hannah Chang, and I'm a student at the Graduate School of Education here at Harvard. while I don't think many people doubt the admirable aspirations and intentions of No Child Left Behind, in closing the achievement gap and providing equity for all students, as they say, the devil is in the details. And I was wondering if you could respond to critiques such as providing just a wealth of information and data based on test scores doesn't necessarily equate to educators, administrators having the capacity to use that data adequately in changing instruction. And also, the second part is that with supplemental educational services, I think a lot of the districts have complained that they don't actually have it's a huge administrative burden to actually provide those services. And because Title I funds, 20%, I believe, is supposed to be set apart for providing supplemental educational services. If they don't have the administrative capacity to provide that, that money just is sitting there. And I believe in New York, in Buffalo, there's several $1 million just sitting there unused.
You need a question mark.
Yes. So how do you respond to those details that are problematic?
Well, let's take the kind of the middle of your discussion.
Okay.
How do we believe that measuring students would translate into improved instruction? We believe that once teachers get the information, the feedback from the assessment, it informs their instruction. And whether or not teachers are prepared to use data to make data-based decisions to inform their instruction, we know that teachers are getting better and better at that every day. And we do realize that we need to help some. First, we need to enable success. That's why the present budget has about $5.1 billion in it to enhance teacher quality. And it'll be sent out to states so states can make decisions on how best to help teachers. We believe that there's no higher leverage insertion point to help than at the point of the teacher and the student. That's where we think the full magic happens. And the reason for assessing them is simply to get more information, because with this more information that informs instructions, we think that makes the instructional situation much better.
Thank you all for coming tonight. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being so generous with your time. Thank you.